It's time to root out the Xenos heretics and demons amongst us. Let's see what the Imperial Inquisition can do in 9th. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Inquisitors, and with the recent reprint of the Inquisition rules in the Warzone Octarius books, I thought it would be quite a good time to review what they can offer to Imperial armies and how they work in 9th in general. In the video we'll talk about the Inquisition and how they function in 40k, the core rules of their mini codex and how they work, a quick look at each one of their many datasheets, and finish up by talking about the most common ways that you might want to add them to your army. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. So as I'm sure the majority of you will know, the Imperial Inquisition has almost unchecked power within the Emperor's domain, shadowy independent agents that can requisition entire armies at the drop of a hat, and condemn entire worlds to oblivion if they think that it will better serve the Empire as a whole. They're split into the three main allegiances: Ordo Malleus that deals with demons, Ordo Hereticus that deals with psychers and traitors, and the Ordo Xenos that dedicate themselves to the threat of the alien races. They've recently had their rules reprinted in Warzone Octarius. I believe the current rules can be found in the Rising Tide book. To represent them in-game, there's two main ways that you can add them to an Imperial army. They don't really have enough units to field an entire force of themselves right now, so you can either add just one Inquisitor to an Imperial detachment without taking up a battlefield slot. If you do so, then he doesn't break any army-wide special rules, so you still get your combat doctrines if you're Space Marines and things. Or you can include them as a sort of allied detachment, an Inquisition Vanguard detachment, where you take one Inquisitor and 3 of their support units. Out of the two, I think people are far more likely to just field the one lone allied Inquisitor. Fielding a Vanguard is going to mean that you're going to have to pay 3 command points for the privilege, and I think that's a fairly hefty tax to pay. It can be good fun in a more fun and fluffy army though, as opposed to one that's super hyper optimized. Either way though, usually you're just going to be operating with the one Inquisitor. You can't take more than one in a detachment. As well as these detachment rules, the various Ordos have their quarry special rules built in. This allows you to reroll all hit and wound rerolls against their given targets. The Ordo Malleus gets it against Chaos and Demon units, Hereticus gets it against Chaos and Psyker units, Xenos obviously against Xenos, and you can use the Ordo Minoris special rules, which represents any of the other lesser known inquisitorial branches, and they get their rerolls against enemy characters. All of those are really helpful, and certainly very powerful if you are fighting against one given faction, but seeing as you don't know what your opponent's going to turn up with, it is a bit hit or miss. I guess if there's absolutely loads of Xenos in the meta, it might sway you towards that branch of Inquisitor, for example. As well as this, the units also gain the authority of the Inquisition special rule, basically allowing them to ride in any transport. That one is kind of handy. It means that you can have an Inquisitor along for a ride as a support character to jump out and do Psychic, and it's not too bad for their support units either, things like the Acolytes or the Jakairo. They tend to be at least relatively hard-hitting, but relatively easy to kill. Just as a baseline, here's the datasheet for the standard Inquisitor model. He's a 60-point character, hits on 3s, strength and toughness 3, 5 wounds and 4 attacks, and a 4+ save. At base is just armed with a bolt pistol and chainsword, and I think most of the time you're going to want him to be a Psyker, as he gets that upgrade for free if he wants it, and that also allows him to take a Force Sword as well. A pretty nice buff to his melee abilities if you want one. For ranged weapons, he's really got quite a lot of options for firepower. You can take Melter Guns or Inferno Pistols, an Incinerator for some Strength 6 AP-1 Flamer action, a free Needle Pistol that doesn't have any AP but wounds on 2s, and the various more standard things like Combi Weapons or Storm Bolters. I think how much you tool them up really depends on what sort of role you're using them for. I'd be kind of tempted to give them at least some sort of multi-damage combat weapon, seeing as they do have a fair amount of relatively accurate attacks. And I could happily either take or leave a more fancy ranged weapon. I guess an extra melter shot isn't the worst thing ever if you do think they're going to get to fire it at least once. I think keeping them completely cheap though is perfectly acceptable if all you want them to do is be a maximally efficient psychic buffing unit. As well as the quarry and authority of the Inquisition special rules which we've already talked about, he also gets unquestionable wisdom. That's an aura of 6 inches where Imperium units can use his very good leadership of 9. That can be quite meaningful on some armies such as Imperial Guard. As well as that, he gets a Refractor Field for a 5+ invul save, and if you choose not to make him a Psyker, he still gets the Iron Will special rule, where he basically gets to deny a psychic power as if he were a Psyker. I think that the Standard Inquisitor is one of the most useful datasheets in the book, just because you do have the flexibility of different psychic powers, warlord traits and relics on him, and while all the other special character Inquisitors do get fancy stuff, sometimes maybe all you want is something cheap to deliver some psychic powers efficiently. There is another generic Inquisitor available. This is the Ordo Malleus Inquisitor in Terminator armor, though he's in a bit of a weird place at the moment. As far as I can tell, his rules are only in Psychic Awakening, the previous expansion book, but they weren't in this more recent Warzone Octarius book. That perhaps softly implies to me that he's not actually aimed to be a current datasheet, but I think still technically rules as written he's still part of the game. As far as I know, they haven't done anything to make him officially obsolete. In any case, he pays 35 points more than the standard Inquisitor and gets Terminator armor and an extra wound for his privileges. He also gets free Deep Strike as well, so he might be a good choice if you want him to drop in alongside some other troops. But on the downside, he is locked to the Ordo Malleus, you can't take him from the other Ordos, and that Terminator armor might stop him from riding in certain Space Marine vehicles. Otherwise, for the generic unit choices, we have their 3 different support units that function in the elite slot, so you have to take the Inquisitorial Vanguard detachment to take them. First up, we get Acolytes, essentially a unit of 1 to 6 Imperial Guardsmen with 2 attacks each. They can function to try and protect the Inquisitor a bit with their Loyal Servant rule, intercepting hits on the roll of a 2+, or they can function as kind of special weapon caddies. Some of the Inquisitorial buffing rules are really quite nice for Acolytes, so you could have a bunch of them with plasma guns or melter guns or something, though I would bear in mind that they do get very pricey very quickly. Say to take a plasma gun Acolyte, you're going to be paying 20 points for that, for just a couple of shots hitting on 4s. In reality, I think most of the time that's just nowhere near worth it. And perhaps the single most interesting use of the unit is that if you take just 1 Acolyte, it gains the character keyword, so I guess in theory you've got some shooting that could be protected by the Lookout Sir rule if you like that. I guess they're a little bit more likely to fire their guns a few times if they are safely protected within your army's ranks. Perhaps about the easiest thing ever to snipe though, if there are a couple of sniper rifles on the opposing team. Next up we have the Demon Host. These guys are single model character units in the elite slot, 25 points each, hitting on 4s, strength and toughness 4, 4 wounds and 3 attacks, and a 5+ demon save. They attack a little bit weirdly with a single Unholy Gaze attack, which is strength 8 but only damage 1 unless you roll a 6, and they get their Warp Grasp in melee, which gives them 3 attacks at AP-3 damage 1. Each movement phase they get a random buff, either flying, healing any lost wounds, or getting a few mortal wounds on nearby enemy units, though to be honest any of these just can't be relied on whatsoever, so they might do something helpful, they might do nothing. I guess they could be a somewhat annoying distraction unit, they are somewhat tough for the points, but I think perhaps the best use of the Demon Host is paired with Inquisitor Eisenhorn, as we'll get onto. Finally, last but not least, we have the orangutans of 40k in the Jokairo Weaponsmith. He's a little bit weedier in a fight, his toughness 3, 3 wounds and a 5+ invul save again, but he actually has pretty reliable and reasonably strong firepower. His Jokairo weapons are the strike with a single shot at strength 8 AP-3 damage 3, or a scattershot attack with 6 shots at strength 4 AP-1 up close. At the start of each shooting phase he makes someone shooting a little bit better nearby. It's usually going to be him or an Inquisitor. On a 1 or 2 that model gets to re-roll their hit rolls when shooting, on a 3 or 4 they get to re-roll the wound rolls when shooting, and on a 5 or 6 they get both. As it goes, that makes a single shot really quite powerful for just the 20 points, and I think out of the 3 supporting choices for the Inquisitors, the Jokairo are by far my favourites. A trio of these, screened from enemy attack, do seem like they could be a bit of a menace, handing out a few really quality anti-tank shots per turn with some decent rerolls. Still though, it does mean that you'd have to commit to a Vanguard detachment in the first place, which I think is perhaps their biggest weakness just for a few 20-point models. I think perhaps one of the most efficient uses might actually be for Inquisitor Karamazov. Getting full rerolls on that mastercrafted multi-melter of his could be really cool. So now we've talked through the generic units of the Codex, let's go through a few of the ways that you can augment the Inquisitors, stratagems, warlord traits, relics and psychic powers. After that I think we'll talk through the various Inquisitorial special characters. First up we've got 6 different stratagems, and I think that perhaps the most efficient one is for 1 command point to give an extra warlord trait and relic to an Inquisitor. I think that one's almost a no-brainer if you are including an Inquisitor in the force, though it's a bit more situational on the special character ones. Otherwise, for 1 command point you can get an aura of reroll ones to hit against their quarry for nearby Imperial infantry. I think that one's pretty usable but a bit niche. If you're fighting an army that's entirely made up of their quarry, then sure, that's a bit of extra damage output. If not, it's not going to matter. There's a huge 4 command point one called Execution Bombardment. That's one way to throw a fair few mortal wounds into the enemy ranks. I think most of the time it's not going to be worth the enormous command point cost, but I guess if you've got an absolutely huge amount of enemy units all stacked up in one place, it might well just about make it worth it. It basically throws out the mortal wounds within a 2d6 radius, and on a 4+, each unit takes d3. It's not really going to wipe out squads for the most part, but could potentially cause a fair amount of early game damage. I think to make it worth it though, you need to catch something like 8 units, if not more. Next up, there's a 1 command point infiltrate option for the Inquisitor and their retinue. You can forward deploy with the Inquisitor and up to 1 Jacairo, Acolyte and Demon Host. In theory, being able to set up forward is kind of powerful, but for the most part the Inquisitor and their allies are kind of fragile. They're the sort of units that want to be screened and buff your own units, and seeing as you don't know who's going to be going first when you put them down, you might well be taking a big risk of them just getting deleted early. I guess might be a way to get some early actions on objectives if you desperately need them. Next for 1 CP we have Alpha Class Psyker. The Inquisitor knows 1 more psychic power and can deny once more. Could potentially allow you to take a few more of the psychic tools into battle. They are quite good. And finally 1 CP for a pretty much auto use one, which if you do manage to kill an enemy character within 3 inches, you then regenerate D3 command points, and the rest of the enemy army is -1 leadership army wide. It gives them an extra nice reward if you can use them to wipe out an enemy character, maybe with a smite or something, or even just have them standing nearby while your other units take them down. -1 leadership could be seriously quite annoying against the wrong army, if they do happen to be using a lot of non-fearless infantry. Next up we have their 6 warlord traits, and you can buy 1 in for 1 command point as we mentioned. Radical allows you a reroll a turn, that could make their psychic really quite reliable. Puritan gives you a +1 invul, so a small toughness boost. Formidable Resolve gives you a +1 leadership and an extra 6-inch bubble for their unquestionable wisdom leadership ability. That's actually potentially powerful. Leadership 10 on a massive 12-inch bubble is going to absolutely sort morale for your army if you are using a lot of units where it's relevant, maybe things like big units of guardsmen. Then there's 3 Ordo locked traits. Hereticus gives you a 6-inch heroic intervention and a 4+ chance to stop enemy units falling back. The last bit could be annoying if you were coordinating with other assault troops perhaps. Xenos is a really quite nice one, giving you a 5+ chance to generate command points every time your opponent uses a strat. That one seems almost auto-include if you are using a Xenos Inquisitor and you weren't taking another Warlord trait. I think on average you're usually going to get more back than you spend for that. But finally, I must admit the Ordo Malleus one is by far my favourite. It's a massive psychic boost where you get to know an extra psychic power, and you also get to cast and deny 1 more. The Inquisition psychic powers are quite good, and this essentially doubles your Inquisitor's power as a psyker, and I think that that's absolutely excellent. So in my opinion that's probably the strongest, but if you're not using a Malleus Inquisitor, the Xenos command point regeneration or the reroll option which you could use on psychic, both of those seem great. So with all this talk of psychic powers, let's take a look at them. The Inquisition one gets the Telethesia discipline, a discipline of 6 different powers, and then there's another 3 that you can choose to take depending on what ordo you are. I do think that the psychic powers are perhaps the most interesting part of the whole Inquisition Codex, as they're really quite useful things that you can add to other allied armies, ways to debuff the enemy, or to buff your other Imperial allies. First up we have Terrify, which gives you -1 leadership and no overwatch. The -1 leadership's kind of meh, but preventing overwatch really could be relevant if you are charging in with something fairly fragile. Psychic Fortitude is warp charge 4 for ignores morale, very rarely going to be worth it I think. With that unquestionable wisdom ability, you're already helping out morale quite a bit without even casting anything. Dominate's a fun one, a 12-inch one with warp charge 6, and you get to hijack a non-vehicle's weapon if you can roll 3d6 better than their leadership. Depending on what you opportunistically get to target with this, that could be really fun. Say getting a Tau broadside to turn his railguns on his own team, but again is maybe just a little bit situational, particularly as it doesn't affect vehicles. Mental Interrogation is 12 inches and warp charge 6. This one targets a character. They get -1 to hit, and if you can beat their leadership with 3d6, you get a single command point back. I think sometimes that could be pretty nice as a debuff, and the command point certainly wouldn't hurt. Then we have Pursuit for warp charge 12. This one's an 18-inch one that allows you to ignore lookout surf and nearby Ordo units shooting. I guess in theory that could be pretty funny alongside an Inquisitor with a bunch of Joe Cairo. Allow them to target a character directly and then just blow them away with heavy firepower. With all the line of sight blocking terrain and the bodyguard rules in 40k though, I feel that this is a little bit unreliable, particularly as you might fail to cast though. Certainly feels like a fun tactic that you could play around with. The idea of an inquisitorial sniper squad is quite cool. Then we have Castigation, warp charge 6 and 18 inches. This one's a damage dealing one. Again you have to beat their leadership with a roll of 3d6, and if you do then they take d3 mortal wounds. Certainly less reliable damage dealing than Smite, but it's fairly nice that you don't have to use it to target the unit that's closest. And it's maybe not a bad secondary one to have if your buffing powers aren't going to be particularly handy, then just double down on more mortal wound output. Throw that and smite at an enemy, and hopefully you're looking at 2d3 mortals. Finally, we have the 3 order-specific ones. The Hereticus one is a close-range debuff for -1 attack, and if you can beat their leadership on a 2d6, they get -1 to hit too. -1 attack's okay, but I think you're going to have to be quite lucky to get the -1 to hit. The Xenos one is really quite interesting, warp charge 5, and it means that enemy units can't shoot your auto units that are within 6 inches of the Inquisitor unless they're the closest, and they can't even charge them unless they're within 6 inches. For me, that seems like it might be one of the best ways to try and make acolytes work. It doesn't really matter if they're just stupidly easy to kill off if you can't even shoot them in the first place, and hopefully it means unless the enemy can get really close indeed, then you might be able to have several turns shooting with things like Jokairo guns and anything else that you can bring to bear. Certainly seems like an awkward one though if you do fail it unexpectedly. Finally, we have the Malleus one, which again, like the Warlord trait, I think is one of the best. It's warp charge 6, and it's a 12-inch buff to a nearby Imperium infantry or bike unit, and it just hands them out a 5+ invul save. It's not exactly the world's strongest defensive buff, but it can still be pretty dramatic on units that aren't costed for it. Maybe some of the best recipients are things like Imperial Guard conscripts, or the Sisters of Battle Arco-flagellants. Both of those can come in really quite big meaty units, and a nice invul save could make the difference between the squad being wiped out or surviving on an objective. I think that's certainly one of the better things that an Inquisitor can bring as an ally. Finally, we've got a small clutch of relics. I may be a little bit less enthused about the relics as being actually all that strong, but I guess they're generally quite fun. There's a defensive one with -1 to be wounded, that has certainly upped their survivability a little bit. There's the Blade of the Ordo, which is a strength +1 power sword with AP -3 and damage D3. It goes up to flat damage 3 against their quarry as well, which is kind of handy. I feel like if you're stuck for one to go for, that one's not really the worst. It makes them a little bit more dangerous in close combat without having to pay extra points for something like a force weapon. Then there's a Relic Inferno pistol with 12-inch range that also gets +2 damage against chaos as well as just if you're in half range for it. Again, I think that one's pretty fun. An Inferno pistol isn't really much for an investment at 5 points, and getting its range out to 12 does make it a lot more threatening. There's then the Tainted Blade, a demon weapon with strength +3, AP -3 and damage 1. There's a small chance for it to rebel and deal you a mortal wound, but if you do cause any damage, then you get to make a further attack. Getting strength 6 is quite nice on an Inquisitor, though damage 1 and the chance for it to rebel are both unhelpful. That one's only for Malleus Inquisitors. The Relic Inferno pistol is just for Hereticus, by the way. Finally, the Xenos-related relic is the Universal Anathema. That one gives your melee weapons a 2+ to wound anything that isn't a vehicle or Titanic unit, and I'd say that that's quite nice paired with something like a Force Sword. It's got decent AP and decent damage, so if you're wounding on a 2+ as well, you're likely to inflict some carnage. To be honest, most of these seem usable enough. I'd be most likely to use them just as a side effect of using that stratagem to get an extra Warlord trait in, and I'm not really sure that any of them are significantly powerful to really rise above the rest. Kind of depends on what your Inquisitor's going to be doing, which relics they can actually take, and what sort of things they might be fighting. Overall though, out of these sections, I think on the psychic power front my favourite things are the no Overwatch, the 5+ invul, and just the chance for a little bit more mortal wound damage. And for the relics I really don't have all that many strong feelings, but obviously it's worth taking one if you are getting the Warlord trait anyway. Moving on, let's just touch on each of the named character Inquisitors and see what they can bring to the table rather than the basic model. We'll focus on how many points more they are and what they can bring to the table. First up we have Inquisitor Kotias. He's leadership 10 and has a 2+ save, so a better morale boost, far harder to kill, and he's really quite punchy in melee with a mastercrafted Nemesis Demon Hammer. 4 attacks hitting on 3s at strength 6 and AP -3, damage 3. He's perhaps the most psychically adept of any of the Inquisitors. He gets to cast 2 powers, and if you give him a Warlord trait, then he gets to manifest 1 additional, so he could cast 3, though because he only knows a certain amount of powers, they'd be 2 from the Telesthesia discipline plus Smite. Still though, that's really solid. You don't get many 3-cast Psychers less than 100 points. He's okay in combat as well, has a small shooting attack with his Cyber Eagle, and has a fun spy network special rule that could allow you to try and intercept some enemy reserves with his Cyber Eagle, and is good for reducing the enemy's command points by 1, an ability that could effectively prevent the opponent from using certain stratagems if they have depleted their stock by quite a bit. He's only 95 points, and to be honest I think as Inquisitors go he really is quite strong. Loads of psychic powers, decent melee and defense, a couple of helpful special rules, and he even buffs leadership better than average. Next up we have Eisenhorn, who's 85 points, and has a few similar advantages. He's leadership 10 as well, and he will again be able to cast 2 different powers from the Telesthesia discipline as he casts 2 and knows 2, but he can't do them both while also smiting. It's got a couple of alternate melee attacks in combat, and if you do take his Radical Warlord trait, that could make him really quite a reliable psyker as well, re-rolling one psychic test when he casts. He gets a couple of very mild fun shooting attacks in an Artificer Bolt Pistol and Electro Bane Grenades, and a 6+ Feel No Pain type rule, so he's a little bit harder to kill than some. Maybe the most interesting special rule he has though is that he gets a souped up demon host, and he can choose to spawn in Malus Codiceum at the cost of losing his unquestionable wisdom aura. I guess if you're seeing an Inquisitor summoning demons right in front of you, then you are going to worry about him just a bit. That demon host is extra punchy as well. He gets +2 strength, toughness, wounds and attacks, and when he's nearby he also gets +1 to hit and wound as well, and +1 to its invul save. Basically it becomes almost like a mini demon prince, but his attacks are only damage 1. Again, I do think that just for 25 points extra over the standard Inquisitor, Eisenhorn's really worth looking at. I mainly just quite like him for the 2 very reliable psychic powers, plus being Auto Xenos does have its perks as well. But basically being able to go into counter-attack mode by putting down that demon host and going on a rampage, it does seem like a nice way to surprise enemy units jumping into your lines. I would bear in mind though that I believe as you create the Malus Codiceum model, you would have to set aside 25 reinforcement points before the game to allow you to summon him in. So if you are playing with a demon host, you could really see Eisenhorn as an 110 point model rather than an 85 point one. Next up we come to Inquisitor Greyfax, 90 points for another special character Leadership 10 Inquisitor. She's an Ordo Hereticus one, and gets some quite nice combat gear for taking down Psykers. She has a Master-crafted power sword with damage 2, and gets to be sort of an anti-Psyker sniper, as she gets a Condemner bolt gun that can strike against Psyker or Demon characters and ignore Lookout Sir for that, and if she gets to hit a Psyker character with her Condemner stake, they take D3 mortal wounds just automatically. On the downsides, she doesn't cast quite as well as the other Inquisitors. She can only manifest 1 power, but she does deny twice, and gets +1 to deny the witch tests. Between all her special rules, she could be an interesting choice if you want to add a little bit more anti-Psyker into an army. 2 denies on +1 are really handy, and getting some automatic mortal wounds on Psykers really is quite nice, particularly with all the Great Knights and Thousand Suns about these days. I guess you might kind of want to weigh up against a Calexis Assassin though, who's a fairly similar points cost and can also be added in for anti-Psyker to other Imperial armies. Next up we have Inquisitor Karamazov, the priciest of the Inquisitors at 125 points, and one of the mightiest as well, as he sits atop the Throne of Judgment, giving him strength and toughness 5, 8 wounds, and some scary fighting power on top of that. He gets a pretty nice Mastercrafted multi-melter, 2 shots at 30 inches with the melter rules, and he fights better than any of the other Inquisitors I'd say. 4 attacks with a Mastercrafted power sword at strength 6, AP -3 and damage 2, and then another 2d3, strength 5, AP -1, damage 2 attacks with a Throne of Judgment stomping feat. Karamazov isn't a Psyker, instead he has a -1 to cast for enemy models within 12, the Iron Will special rule to make him have a chance to resist a psychic test, Dread Reputation to make an enemy infantry unit -1 leadership within 6 inches, and it's kind of interesting if you do take the Formidable Resolve Warlord trait with him, as that gives you a massive 12-inch aura of leadership 11, which is basically going to make morale barely a thing for virtually any Imperial army. I think in general Karamazov is a bit of a fun choice, though he does perhaps feel a lot more like he's a combat character rather than a buffing character compared with the other Inquisitors. Maybe similar sort of shooting and melee to what you get with a Dreadnought, but also with character protection as well. I really don't think he does all that much for nearby units though. The leadership thing is nice where it matters, but the enemy debuffs just seem a little bit situational. I just can't really see too many armies choosing to include him, compared with say a more fighty character out of their own codex. The most recent datasheet addition to the Inquisitors is Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus. She's a Xenos Inquisitor for 85 points, gets a 2+ weapon skill and a 3+ armor save, and reasonably good melee with strength 6 power fist attacks, hitting on a 3+. She's not quite as strong as Psyker, she only casts 1 and denies 1, though her Psychic Familiar does allow her to do a targeted smite, so she can choose her target within 18 inches, rather than just having to go for the closest. She's got quite a fun relic Eldar Shuriken Catapult called Dirge Singer. It's got 18-inch range and 2 damage, though I think perhaps the single most interesting thing that she brings to the table are her Paralysis Grenades. When she makes a charge, she gets to nominate 1 enemy unit to fight last this turn, so I guess perhaps the best idea is to charge her into battle alongside some other fighting melee troops, and then you know that your opponent isn't going to interrupt and kill them first. For winning in melee across the board in 9th edition, it really is quite a nice ability to have. Some armies really don't have all that much easy access to it, I guess you could perhaps see her as an interesting alternative to something like a Space Marine Justiciar perhaps, one that as well as giving a bit of fight's last, also can cast another helpful psychic power. Obviously though, her ability is a fair bit less helpful than the Justiciar's. It only works when she's actually made a charge, so not if you are being charged, so she can't use it defensively. Finally, for the Inquisitorial special characters, we have this pair, a couple of Forge World made ones, Solomon Locke and Hector Rex. Both of them have their datasheets in the Imperial Armor Compendium. Solomon Locke's only 75 points, so is the cheapest named character Inquisitor. Though to be honest, I think I'd argue that he's far worse than the standard Inquisition datasheet. He attacks with his Blade of Surety, which is a strength 4, AP-3, damage 2 power sword, and gets a slightly souped up bolt pistol, but doesn't even get any psychic powers, and no choice of Warlord trait other than the really basic Inspiring Leader one, just +1 to leadership of models nearby. I think he's only really one that you'd run for fluff purposes, or even just use his model and use the standard Inquisitor's datasheet to represent it. Hector Rex, on the other hand, I think is a bit more interesting. He's a Lord Inquisitor, so the same as Kyria Draxus, he gets weapon skill 2+, and for his 100 points, he comes equipped in Terminator armor, so 6 wounds and a 2+ save to keep him safer. Again, he gets a very similar mastercrafted power sword, though he strikes a little bit harder with it, as he's strength 4 base, and if he does happen to be scrapping with demons, they suffer 1 mortal wound every time they're wounded, as well as the attack's regular damage. Again, he's a very decent psyker, he knows 2 telesthesia powers, can cast 2 and deny 2, and in addition gets a Space Marine style psychic hood with extra deny capability up close, and aside from Karamazov is perhaps the tankiest of the Inquisitors. That Sanctic shield that he carries gives him a 4+ invul save, +1 to your saving throw, and even a 5+ shrug off against mortal wounds. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid choice if you want those psychic powers on a model that can deep strike. He is auto malleus, so he does have the potential to hand out that 5+ invul save. So overall, I do think that there's quite a lot of good stuff within the Inquisition Codex. I'd say that a lot of them are usable, but certainly not auto-include by any stretch of the imagination. I think that's probably for the best though, as otherwise we'd basically see every single Imperial army headed by an Inquisitor. I do think for just being pure fighty characters, pretty much none of them are really worth it for that alone. Even the toughest ones really aren't all that hard to take down, not compared with a few of the scariest threats in 9th edition. So really I think to be worth it, they do need to leverage their combat damage potential, but also provide something a little bit more to the army, whether it's a bit of command point farming, or more likely some helpful psychic powers. I would bear in mind the other major downside of Inquisitors though, if you do bring a psyker along to an army that doesn't have any psykers in, it will stop you taking that Abhor the Witch secondary, which can be really good against certain armies like Grey Knights or Thousand Sons. Sometimes that can be a fairly tricky trade-off. You do get some nice psychic defense against them with Deny the Witch, but in a close game that secondary could potentially be game-changing. As I said at the start, I think that pure Inquisition Vanguard detachment just really doesn't seem to be worth it. 3 command points I think is just too much of a tax for a few Acolyte units, and I can't say that I've ever seen it played in a successful competitive list. I do quite like the Jacairo, but unless you're looking for a more fun and fluffy game, I just don't really think that they can be worth the 3 command points. Still though, there's really quite a lot of good stuff that they can offer. Ideally, if you can get a use out of 1 or 2 of these roles, plus potentially some mortal wounds from smite and some melee damage, then I think that you could be doing quite well. I really like the 5+ invul save that you can kick out from a Malleus Inquisitor, great for some units like Arco-Flagellants that don't get an armor save, or maybe a big blob of Cadian White Shields parking themselves on a midfield objective and just being really annoying to shift. The leadership boost for Unquestionable Wisdom can be really good on certain armies, and even helpful on Space Marines in some cases. A bit of psychic defense could be helpful if you don't care too much about Abhor, particularly Greyfax could be useful for that, though I would consider Colexus Assassins. I quite like the command point farming Warlord trait from Xenos, can be an extra bit of value if you aren't using the Warlord trait for anything else. It could well generate you an extra command point or 2 over the course of the game. Being able to flex into some mortal wound damage could actually surprise an opponent. Smite plus castigation could be enough to really whittle down a squad. And finally, as we mentioned, fighting last from Kyria Draxus on the charge could be interesting for certain armies that don't get it. Overall, plenty of edge case uses. I could certainly see justifying plenty of the Inquisitor types, perhaps most likely a very cheap and cheerful standard one with a couple of casts from the Malleus trait, but I think that Kotiaz and Eisenhorn both offer some really nice extra things for their upgrades, and a lot of the others fill some more niche roles. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed the video, and please let me know what you think about Inquisitors in 9th edition. Have you had any success using them, or have you been on the receiving end of some inquisitorial wrath? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to quickly mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Making all the YouTube videos, particularly big long review ones like this, does take an enormous amount of time. If you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, being able to see certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.